Hello, welcome to Blogging Heads. I'm Tim Carney. I'm the senior political columnist at the Washington Examiner, and I'm here with Tim Fernholz, who used to be here in Washington, but now he's in California as the business editor of Good magazine. And Tim, we were going to start by talking about the presidential race, specifically Herman Cain's travails. So why don't you tell us what you have to say on that?
Well, I mean, what more can be said about Herman Cain? It just seems like things just keep getting worse for him, or really worse for his political campaign, not really for what I think is his actual motivation, which is to make a lot of money and sell a lot of books and become a very visible conservative activist. And I think this will only help him with that as long as he avoids any further legal entanglements. But I don't know. I think one of the more interesting things, I think, here's what I think about the Republican race is that Mitt Romney is going to win. I think it's hard to see a situation where he doesn't. I have noticed already the emergence of Republican Pumas, which is a great thing to see as people are sort of pre-attacking Mitt Romney. Yep. It'll be interesting to see if that is the same sort of non-story that it was for the original Pumas with Clinton and Obama. But, I think the weird thing about Herman Cain is just how much these allegations have been, the allegations of sexual harassment and what sounded yesterday like sexual assault have been just sort of dismissed by a lot of people in the Republican world and conservative world and things like that. I don't understand why you would carry a brief force. I mean, I don't know. It's just sort of an interesting phenomenon of the political world that people feel the need to defend him for these things and not even willing to sort of say, we don't know what's happening. We'll wait and see. But to say these allegations are nonsense. People are making jokes in the workplace. It's all politically correct. It's like, well, at this point, you've paid 2 settlements, you've had 4 accusations, you had yesterday's press conference with sort of graphic description. I don't get it. And I just wish that if anything would come out of this, I would love to see Republican voters, reject Herman Cain for the sexual harassment thing and do a solid for the country as a whole on their way to nominating Mitt Romney. But we will see how that turns out. I don't know. What do you think about it?
I have a lot of thoughts about what you said, but on the sort of immediately distrusting the accusations, there's a couple things. One, it is unfortunate that when you're being tried in the media, there often is a guilty until proven innocent thing going on, and that if you're running for office, no matter what the truth ends up being, you kind of can end up getting smeared. So some of that is going on. On the other hand, when was the last time that a woman came forward publicly with her face and her name with an accusation of sexual misconduct against a politician and it wasn't true? In other words, maybe, we don't need to rehash Bill Clinton and Anita Hill or anything here, but we can say that it's been at least 20 years since something like that happened. When things like this come out about politicians, when women attach their name and their face to this, at least in my memory, generally there's some element of truth in there. And the notion that this woman could somehow gain by coming out and attacking Cain in this way, that's possible that she's trying to do that, but then she's a really bad sort of businesswoman and student of recent political history. Monica Lewinsky is not better off. Jennifer Flowers is not better off. Women who lied or told the truth are not better off from having made these accusations against powerful people. And so the other idea is possibly that they're being paid off by some candidate. I have trouble imagining, because I agree with your sentiment that Herman Cain's not really running for president, I have trouble imagining somebody having a huge incentive to do that. Maybe, I guess, Rick Perry's campaign would worry that some of the thunder would be stolen from, but this doesn't seem like something that I would chalk up to a Rick Perry type politics. Maybe I don't know enough about him. But so my presumption, it's sort of, we need to find out more about this. And I would hope that everything would come out before Iowa so that people were voting on some basis of knowledge and not on vague accusations or specific accusations and general denials. But I, too, am sort of befuddled by the response of a lot of conservatives just immediately trusting Cain and distrusting his accusers, in part because falsely accusing a politician of something like this just isn't something that really happens a lot. And powerful men abusing that power to sexually harass or possibly even assault women is something we know that happens in the country.
Well, it's good.
So I guess we agree. But the question, the other thing I think we need to talk about is the phenomenon of pretending to run for president. I had thought of Herman Cain as running for vice president. The reason I didn't think he was running for president is because he doesn't go to Iowa. He doesn't go to New Hampshire. He doesn't have a huge campaign team. He seems to be able to raise money. He seems to be able to get attention. But as far as doing things that will actually result in getting votes and increasing the likelihood of you being the Republican nominee, he's not doing those. So I thought he wasn't really running for president. You think he's mostly trying to sell a book and become famous?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a pretty good, business model pioneered, I think, by Newt Gingrich, the king of threatening to run for president and writing a lot of books. That and Sarah Palin is a great example of this. I think Sarah Palin maybe did it accidentally, but in the beginning, she was actually running for vice president, and good for her. But by the end, in the last 4 years since that election, the last 3 years, she's just been sort of flirting with a run, I think, for her own bottom line, which is great. It's what famous people do. It's what, people do all the time. I mean, I'm trying to think if there was a good liberal analogy in the 2008 election. I guess Kucinich and Ron Paul are more of like
their idea.
But like, I mean, Newt Gingrich likes to tell people he's an ideas candidate, but he's not. And I think, Herman Cain maybe was running for vice president, but I think, there's a reason. One of the reasons that he's not in Iowa and New Hampshire that you mentioned is because he's doing a book tour across the South with his book.
Yeah.
So, who knows? I mean, I think you enter into this sort of thing thinking, hey, I'll raise my profile, I'll sell some books. Maybe I'll be vice president of the United States. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'll be president, but I don't think that.
Now, I'll admit, I thought that Barack Obama was running for vice president 4 years ago, or that he was running to be, the 2012/2016 nominee. But
the John Huntsman theory.
Yeah, but Obama actually was building real networks in the important states in a way that Cain hasn't been. And so this is part of why when people would call Cain the front runner, I'd say, I think there's a lot of ways in which people are sort of have stupid readings of polls. And they say, Cain's getting a big bump from this. That doesn't mean, that means that that conservatives are negatively reacting to what they see as a media witch hunt. It doesn't mean that Cain's actual support is growing. If you measure support as people likely to vote for him for president. And then Cain leading in the national polls and the Iowa polls, I didn't think was as important as the fact that Mitt Romney had steadily been growing his share in polls in Iowa and nationally, as well as in South Carolina, and even in New Hampshire, he was pulling away. Since Labor Day, Romney's numbers in all of those, nationwide, New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina, Romney was going up in all of those very slowly, and that he actually does have a campaign infrastructure. I think Mitt Romney has basically been the most likely guy to win the Republican nomination, except for maybe a week in August where I would have bet on Perry. If you made me bet on one candidate, there's no doubt in my mind I would bet on Romney winning the nomination.
Yeah. No disagreement there. I mean, I think the question for Romney is how long does this sort of crazy primary going on help him or hurt him? And, like, how serious are some of the other candidates about dragging this thing out? Do they have the ability to do so? I don't know. We'll have to see.
And it would depend on how sort of nuclear they would want to go or how much they would want to be a team player. Romney was a total team player 4 years ago. Once he lost New Hampshire, he said, all right, I got to, really have to run away with the rest of the field or McCain's the guy. And I was in the hall at the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, when Romney was announcing that he was dropping out. It had leaked out, and those of us, you couldn't get a good cell signal in the hall, but those of us who stepped out into the part of the hotel where you could get a good signal were getting the texts and the emails and the Twitter messages. But most of the people who were sitting in the seat waiting for Romney were these diehard Romney fans, and they didn't know. They were in the middle of the big room, so the word sort of hadn't trickled out there. And when Romney started to announce that he was dropping out, there were all these boos from the supporters he had. which now is really an interesting idea for
Yeah,
me to
that's
think of
true.
Romney even having supporters. Well, part of my point is that he was a team player and he went along. Is there anybody there who would be willing to sort of blow it up and fight to the end? Huckabee didn't really fight to the end. He stayed in until the end, but he wasn't really fighting. He wasn't attacking McCain. So I don't know. I think Romney winning Iowa and then New Hampshire and everybody else dropping out except for, say, Ron Paul, I think that's an entirely likely course of events, which is sort of depressing as both a political reporter and a conservative guy.
Yeah, I can't disagree with your assessment. I don't know. I mean, I think Rick Perry is the only person who could stay in. I mean, he has the money, but I don't know why he would do that. But I don't know why he sort of ran. Well, I know why he ran. He looked really good on paper, and then he found out how hard it is to run for president.
It must be really hard. I would never want to do it.
No, those things sucks.
But we need to find more things to disagree about. So I think banks would be a good.
Let's talk about banks.
One thing was you had MF Global, which was John Corzine's. What would we call it? A hedge fund or?
It was a trading fund. I mean, his thing we've heard so much about is he wanted to make it into like a mini Goldman Sachs, which is where he used to be the CEO, I believe, back in the 90s.
Yeah.
And it was a trading firm, basically. They did a lot of trading.
And so his firm collapsed last week or the week before. One of the very interesting things I found about this was that the creditors of MF Global had the covenant or the contract that goes along with buying the bonds, included what they called a key man provision. This is, as far as experts I talked to in the industry, a very rare provision, but it said, if John Corzine leaves MF Global to take a position in the Obama administration to which he is confirmed by the U.S. Senate, so basically, if Corzine becomes Treasury Secretary, then the creditors will get paid an extra 1 percentage point on their bonds, meaning they were sort of giving a Corzine discount when they were lending to MF Global. So what makes Corzine worth 1 percentage point of your money? Is it that he is some genius? Or is it that he's the kind of guy who is close enough to Obama that he could be even considered for being Treasury Secretary? And so what does this mean sort of about the world of finance? That is that what the game is now? Is figure out who's got connections? I think you're reading
too much probably into that, right? I mean, because remember that MF Global was a firm that, was not super well known, and Corzine came in to take it over as this like high name chief executive. Why would he leave that firm? If he was retiring, that'd be something they could plan for. The only real reason he would leave this vanity firm that he set up, that he came in to save, would be to go into the administration somehow. So it doesn't make me too surprised that if like the top guy at your fund is going to leave, people buying bonds would say, he's valuable in that way. Now, what's interesting is that it doesn't seem like Corzine was able to help the firm very much, either through his financial acumen or through his political connections. And I think what's interesting about all of this talk about too big to fail and things like that is we're going to see now in MF Global a financial firm going bankrupt, the 8th largest bankruptcy in the United States, and see how sort of the fledgling scaffolding of regulatory reform can handle that.
Well, I mean, but isn't the firm really? Isn't MF Global really small? I mean, do they really?
They're not a Goldman Sachs or a J.P. Morgan or a Citibank or anything. That's true.
But that would. I wrote a column on this, in which I, pointed out that he's given the $35,800 to Obama this year, and that he was named early on as a possible Treasury Secretary. He was
named in the press the Great Mentioner. I mean, that's not. I mean, I think I know where you're going with this, but I don't think you're right that this really has a lot to do with the political nexus of the banks and the government. I think what this has to do is John Corzine is probably not a very good risk manager. That was what he was tarred with at Goldman. That's why he was ousted, because he lost a lot of money on the long-term capital management.
Which is even more reason not to pay an extra percentage point to have him in there. I think
bankers are not very smart about risk management. I think it's safe to say that a lot of people in the financial sector think they know a lot more about managing money than in fact they do. But I think if you look at actually why the firm went under, which was a risky bet on European bonds that are now crashing, it's hard to say that, this had something to do with the political.
I'm not saying the crash had anything to do with it. In fact, it's cheering to me that a firm whose CEO, is a max donor to Obama and whom Obama called our guy on Wall Street, and for whom and the CEO was a campaign mouthpiece in 2008 for Obama. He was a proxy on economic issues. It's uplifting to me that his firm can fail. That's the way I felt when Enron went under. I said these guys were so politically connected, especially the Texas connection to Bush. The fact that they went down speaks well of the Bush administration, that they didn't do anything extraordinary to save them. I wouldn't.
Will you say the same thing about the Obama administration now?
Yeah, I wouldn't credit. I'm not going to credit that.
I think your surprise is unwarranted. I will say.
I think because I also think that investors. I remember seeing lots of people in 2007 when that energy bill passed start moving their money to ethanol, and because it's the sort of thing I write on corporate welfare and subsidies. People are like, well, I don't love it, but I may as well get rich off of it. And I kind of have the suspicion that maybe betting on politics, even if you know the way the politics works, isn't a great idea. And one great example of this was a banking committee staffer for Chris Dodd, who invested in Fannie Mae as the plans for Fannie Mae bailout came forward. And so she sort of probably did what would almost be insider trading if it was not in the U.S. Senate. But guess what?
That doesn't make any sense. The Fannie Freddie bailout was the government bought them and took them away from. They seized them essentially.
Well, that was the thing.
Knew that was coming. Why would you invest in it?
No, but we didn't know the form of the bailout, and she bought right before it. Okay, and she did know it was coming, and she ended up losing a ton of money.
I think part of my point, I don't understand what this has to do with like the MF Global or anything else.
Well, this has to do with MF Global because considering that Corzine did not have a stellar track record at Goldman, that he was too risky, that the idea that you would lend the firm money because they had him there, and when we know how supremely connected he was to the Obama administration, I think MF Global was borrowing cheaper than they otherwise would have because of political connections. And I think that the burden of proof...
you built a very sketchy case of circumstantial evidence. I mean, whatever Corzine's problems as a trader, he was the CEO of one of the most successful investment banks in the world, and you don't get there without knowing a thing or two about this. And I think the simpler explanation is that people saw a former Goldman Sachs executive coming in to run this firm who was supported by another Goldman Sachs executive, Christopher Flowers, who was on the board of directors of this company, MF Global, and said, here's a really talented manager we want to hire. We think he's going to do good things. Like, the fact that they were wrong is their problem. But I think you're building a very circumstantial case based on,
I'm certainly not claiming I have absolute proof, but when you look at what they're investing in, they're investing in sovereign debt, which is something that is tied up with
that hedge funds and trading groups have always made a ton of money.
But today, because we know that it has to do with there's this potential collapse, that there are IMF bailouts being talked about, that there are EU bailouts happening. Sovereign debt.
But your argument is self-refuting here, because if Corzine's insider information that he probably, obviously didn't have, that you're accusing him of having, panned out, he wouldn't have made a stupid bet on European debt.
No, what I'm saying is...
In contravention of everything that was happening behind the scenes in Washington and at the IMF and in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're looking for a zebra when a horse will do.
Is that a
you hear the hoofbeats don't think stripes. No, it's an old adage. But I mean, well, basically, it's Occam's razor. I mean, is a more, the more simple explanation here is that John Corzine made a bad bet with his firm, and they went under based on financial circumstances.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that I think it would be silly to dismiss Corzine's political connection when acknowledging the...
Dismiss it from what, though?
When acknowledging the fact...
How did it affect the situation?
It allowed MF Global to borrow at cheaper rates. And that what was Corzine's value to the firm? Some of it was probably his intelligence, yes. But it's hard to find a financial CEO who's more closely connected with the Obama administration. He was a Democratic Senate campaign committee chairman. That means he raised money for all the sitting senators. Okay, that means that he was
Yes.
going around, that he raised money for Barack Obama when he was running for Senate. He was a max donor. He was a campaign spokesman for Obama.
But all of those things are true, and yet at the same time have nothing to do with. I mean, it's the definition of circumstantial evidence. I mean, you can paint this picture.
I'm not trying to
and
convict
you
him
don't
of a
have-
crime. I'm not saying this.
I don't know what you're trying to argue.
I'm trying to
You're just
argue
sort of
that I think that
waving these things in the air and saying it means something, but you won't say what you think.
I think it means that MF Global borrowed at cheaper rates than they could have borrowed at because they saw political connections of John Corzine, and I think that increasingly.
But what did they think those political connections were going to
Okay,
get?
that's a good question. I think there's two things that
Hypothetically, in your circumstantial and I think sort of nonsensical argument, but please tell me, what advantage were they going to get? Do you think it was going to get a special briefing from the IMF
there's
or the ECB?
There's two sort of things that you can get. One is influence, and the other is knowledge. In other words, if Corzine calls up, say somebody on the banking committee who used to be his colleague, for whom he probably raised money, or if he calls up somebody in the Obama administration or the president, or they're just meeting, they're meeting over.
Keep in mind, dear listeners, these are wild hypotheticals that Tim is making up off the top of his head.
No, but my point has to do with what is the mindset of the senior creditors. Senior creditors is a question that's behind all of the Wall Street uncertainty that we've got. In other words, the fact that people expect bailouts is part of that senior creditors expect bailouts is part of the reason that we have bailouts. And it's part of the reason why there isn't proper risk management at the big banks. You look at the credit ratings on bank.
I think that's not a really logical jump to make.
No, it's true. You look at Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, at least those three sort of investment and commercial banks. You look at how Moody's rates them, and Moody's says we have them 3 or 4 notches higher in their credit rating than we otherwise would put them. And the reason that we're notching them 3 or 4 notches higher is because we see the likelihood of a government bailout in case of failure as being very high. And so once
I don't really think Moody's has a lot of ground to stand on. If you'll recall, they fucked up the rating for all of the subprime mortgage bonds and then decided that U.S. debt is not as good as all kinds of silly debt in Bulgaria and around the world. So I don't really think Moody's.
But do you think that affects credit markets?
People expect it probably does. Maybe.
So this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how credit markets behave, not how you would lend your money.
It's wrong, though.
I don't care what you how
people
you
are
lend your money.
incorrect.
Yes, they're incorrect, but that's how they lend their money.
About it.
And when they are lending their money on the assumption of a bailout, that's one of the things that ends up distorting the market. The big guys get cheaper credit because there's an assumption of a bailout. And it takes away the best check on excessive risk-taking is when your senior creditors are worried about you taking too much risk. But now your senior creditors are not worried about you taking too much risk because they believe
I do not think
in a
that's
bailout.
the case at all. When I talk to people who lend money to banks in the course of my day-to-day, they are very concerned about risk management. But I would say this, Tim, I think, you've made you've told your story here, and I think what's good is what we've seen on the ground with MF Global has refuted it completely. And going forward, we will see if another one of these big banks gets in.
And I would love it. I would love it.
I would be willing to bet that it's going to be a big surprise to the senior creditors.
I would be very happy if it was a big surprise, but the fact that they're expecting it, and the fact that I think MF Global's lenders were expecting some sort of
Do you think that these senior
connection.
creditors will look at what happened to MF Global and say, ooh, maybe we're wrong? Or do you
I
think
think
we'll
that-
be yet another case of Wall Street making a terrible decision based on their awful assumptions?
I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, and I think it would be a good thing if you had more bank lenders say, you know what, maybe the bailout days are over. I'm not confident in that because I don't think Dodd-Frank does that.
I wouldn't be either after, the Republicans in the House and Senate really screwed up the resolution mechanism in Dodd-Frank designed to make it easier to shut down these firms. But that's a story for another day.
But we were talking about MF Global tied up with the Euro crisis. You wanted to talk about all the Mediterranean rulers falling or something.
Well, they're all going down. Well, what I wanted to talk about actually was I wanted to get your take on this because I think one of the interesting things is just to stay on the bailout theme for a minute is when we talk about bailing out Greece. which people suggest is key to stopping the contagion here. It's not really bailing out Greece, because Greece is, regardless of what happens, not in for a very stellar decade ahead. We're really bailing out Greek creditors, which are banks in Europe and in the United States as well. And I think people need to understand that more, that what we're doing is not really for Greece. What we're doing, and when I say we, I mean the European community and the vague and mellifluous international community of the IMF and the European Central Bank and all of that, are just trying to keep banks alive. And I think that's an important distinction for people to realize, because there's a lot of blame and anger at the Greeks. I've talked to people who are like, why are these Greeks screwing us over? Well, it's really, obviously the Greeks had a very irresponsible budget system going on, and they can't seem to collect taxes from themselves to save their lives. But it's important to understand that if this deal goes through and the Greeks get bailed out, they are in for austerity for years. That's going to really hurt their economy and hurt their social services. They're not excited about it. And if they don't get bailed out, they are in for never borrowing money again from the international markets, most likely, and years of crushing austerity. So it's not great for the Greeks either way. The real question is what we do about banks in Central Europe. And what I'm getting at is, I think once you realize that we're really helping banks in the financial system, that drives home the need for bail-ins. Bail-ins are when you have debt reduction, principal reduction from the people who lend to Greece and these other countries. And you have to accept some responsibility as a lender that maybe all of those loans you made to Greece didn't help, weren't very smart decisions, and you have to own a little bit of that. And that's part of the deal that the ECB has put together, and we'll see if it goes through. It looks like it is going to at this point, but it seems like there's some new change every day. But where I'm going with this, and what I want to ask you, Tim, is we've seen in these sovereign debt crises before that you need a bail-in to sort of make it work. In the late 90s, there was another crisis that started in Korea and went basically around the globe, and it only ended when you had a bail-in Brazil to cut the debt of these foreign, of the banks. Sorry, to cut Brazil's debt to all of these lenders that had borrowed too much money from. We haven't seen that in the United States yet. And you sent me this morning an interesting article in the Washington Post about how banks have been profiting like crazy in the last 2 years, more so, I guess, than the entirety of the Bush administration because of the Obama administration's continuation of TARP and all of that. But my point is, I think we need a bail-in the United States, which is to do the other half of what we're doing for Greece abroad, which is to cut mortgage principals down, to do those write-downs in a way, because we've seen a great bailout for the Wall Street banks that saved the financial system, did really well by them, increased their compensation, but we haven't seen that sense of shared sacrifice yet. So with so much consumer debt driving down the U.S. economy, where's our bail-in?
Well,
where are my mortgage principal write-downs?
So on a lot of what you're saying, I agree with your thrust, and I definitely agree with a lot of your assessment, that the idea that this is, a Credit Suisse and a Deutsche Bank bailout more than it's a Greek bailout. And that when you see these young Greeks protesting austerity, you have a point, which is you're taking away, the benefits I was dependent on. You're taking away my tax hikes. I mean, you're hiking my taxes, and you're doing this in order to pay off rich bankers in the Swiss Alps and in Germany. That sentiment echoes an element of truth. And again, it's about the moral hazard, and to what extent do we say that banks should have to bear the risks of making bad loans? And the reason we end up coming in and saving the banks, the reason we did it in TARP, the reason the Europeans are talking about it right now, is this view that, well, the banks are so indispensable and there's such a risk of them collapsing because they're so interconnected that we have to really make sure they don't take too big of a hit. And that's a lot of the mindset behind, I think the TARP could have been conducted in a way that more resembled bankruptcy, winding down these financial institutions in an orderly manner rather than what I think they did, which was saving the banks. And in Europe, that would be another way of doing it. So the actual sort of bail-in, where there's a legislative reduction of principal, is not the path that I would take, but it's the same sort of thing that I would take, which again would be letting the borrower, the bankrupt borrower, default. And acknowledging that some of the creditors are going to take huge haircuts, and that those might be, in the case of the U.S., Wells Fargo and AIG, and it might be in Europe, Deutsche Bank, or maybe Bank of America and Goldman Sachs. I don't know. But sort of acting almost as much as possible like this is a normal bankruptcy. And saying, if you lent money to Greece, guess what? You're going to lose almost all of it. And to the degree that they're able to pay some of it back, this is going to happen. I feel like Greece is the underwater homeowner that really ought to just, as much as possible, walk away. So we can't pay these debts. And if this means we can't borrow for years, that might be better than us going through this austerity to make sure that we're refilling the coffers of Goldman and Deutsche Bank. Just like the homeowner whose house is worth, only 60% of what he owes should just be like, all right, credit rating hit is better than me just, slaving away for Wells Fargo and Bank of America. And so similar sort of solution to what you're talking about. My instinct is not to go towards some legislative reduction of principal, but on the housing front, the American bail-in, I would just make sure
the American bail-in. I like that.
I would just make sure that we're not, that we're not doing too much to save the banks, and that if homeowners who walk away need some, additional legal protection, and the bank and the state governments were providing that, I wouldn't oppose that. I mean, that might be the way.
Do you remember by any chance the cram down debate of 2009?
Vaguely, yes.
So one of the
go ahead.
Well, I'll just say for our listeners, in 2009, one of the initial responses to the housing crisis of the Obama administration, let me take it back, that the Democrats in Congress had, was one of the unique things about the American Bankruptcy Code is that judges cannot adjust the mortgage debt that you might have. Any other kind of debt, from car loans, student loans, whatever you have.
Probably not
a
student
bankruptcy
loans,
judge.
but yeah.
That could be wrong.
Car loans, fines, etc. Yeah.
The bankruptcy judge can say it, but you can't do it for a primary residence home, which is really strange, I think, since that's one of the most common forms of debt for people in the United States, and it's also right now one of the problematic ones. So Democrats wanted to pass this bill basically saying, hey, bankruptcy judges can now change this now, and while it wouldn't have helped a ton of people, because going to someone who's underwater on their mortgage and saying, hey, you can go bankrupt is not like an awesome solution. It would have put a lot more pressure on the bottom of the market and given banks, I think, more of an incentive to play fair in their negotiations with underwater borrowers and things like that.
And I think that's better than than most of the things the Obama administration tried, which was sort of
Well, they didn't try it, unfortunately, because here, this is a point for you, I think, Tim, is that our other financial Tim that we love so dearly, Secretary of the Treasury Tim Geithner, opposed this from within the administration because he was worried that it would probably hit too hard against the banks. And admittedly, in March of 2009, it looked like we were going to have to seize Citigroup and the banks were all going to collapse. It's probably something that he would point out. But I think looking back today, we can say it was a major mistake not to support that.
Goldman was already reporting record profits by July of 2009.
So that's a little more decentralized approach to it.
Yeah, and that's you're singing my tune there. And a lot of the Obama administration's proposals have been sort of time after time going after let's keep people in their homes, which is a nice thing to do. But a lot of those were largely sort of paying the banks for not foreclosing on people, or paying the banks for writing down principal, or paying the banks for doing a refinance. So it's a way of sort of trying to buy off the banks. But I feel like we already bought them off, okay? That's what the TARP was about. There should be no more buying off of these banks. They made bad loans, and the only reason they're still alive, or not made bad, they made bad loans and bought bad what do you call them? CDOs. And the only reason a lot of them are still alive probably is because of the bailout. So we shouldn't have to go and bribe them to not evict people. But I also don't want to sort of say, okay, we bailed you out, and so now you're going to do X, Y, and Z. I would rather, as you were suggesting, just try to use sort of regular bankruptcy law as much as possible. And I think we've done that with TARP. we would have been in better shape, and that Europe might have to face this fact too. That guess what? You lent to Greece, okay? You could see their budgets. Their budgets were in secret. It was sort of well known that people there didn't really pay their taxes. I guess I didn't know that, but
I will say technically some of Greece's budget was secret. One of the big things with now departed Prime Minister Papandreou was that he discovered a huge deficit, more than he had expected. Although that might have been one of those gimmies at the beginning of the term.
Yes.
I will note the other great decentralized way to help reduce debt levels and increase growth is to have higher inflation targets and lower interest rates from the Federal Reserve. It's just a pet hobby horse of mine. I just thought I'd mention it.
Yeah, I'm on record
rates.
on one of these things on a blogging head saying inflation is a form of theft. Now, of course, I think bailouts are another form of theft, and subsidies are too.
Theft is just another kind of commercial exchange.
I think we're getting very Mediterranean in our business ethics now, and I think we've probably gone on long enough. And I'm very glad that after a beginning of agreeing too much, we got to the point where you were calling me ridiculous and all that stuff. So,
well, it wouldn't be blogging heads if we didn't have the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, Tim.
Hey, at least we agree about bankruptcy.
Yes, we'll do this again.
Take it easy, Tim.